The glass dome of the Nightfall Palace had survived 1,000 years of war, siege, and sorcery. It would not survive tonight. Lyra pressed her body flat against the iron lattice framework, suspended 60 feet above the throne room floor, her silver-threaded hunter's gear absorbing every ambient sound, every vibration, every trace of her heartbeat into silence. Below her, the court of the Supreme Alpha blazed with shadow lanterns, those cold violet flames that the wolves used in place of honest firelight, as if even their illumination had to be something twisted and wrong. She had trained for 3 years to reach this moment. She had starved, bled, and wept in the dark to earn the right to stand where no hunter had ever stood before and finish what the Order had started 6 centuries ago. She did not think of fear. Fear was a luxury. She thought only of angles. The Supreme Alpha, Kieran of the Nightfall Court, sat on a throne carved from obsidian and shadow-forged iron at the far end of the hall. Even from 60 feet up, even through the distortion of the violet light, he was an overwhelming presence. He was not sitting so much as occupying space, the way a mountain occupies a valley, completely and without apology. His dark hair swept back from a face that was all hard angles and ancient authority, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world he had already conquered. He wore no crown. He did not need one. Every wolf in that room oriented to him the way iron filings orient to a lodestone, not from discipline, but from something primal and inexorable. He was the apex of everything the Silver Moon Order had sworn to destroy. Lyra exhaled once, slow and controlled, the way Master Kale had taught her. She unclipped the twin silver chain blades from her harness, letting them unspool through her fingers until she held their weighted cores in each palm, the enchanted links whispering against her gloves. The blades had been forged in consecrated silver and blessed by 3 high seers of the Order. They were not merely weapons. They were instruments of finality. Against a wolf, against any wolf, they would sing through shadow magic like starlight through smoke. Against the Supreme Alpha, they would end a war. She did not allow herself a breath of hesitation. She set her boots against the lattice, angled her body toward the throne, and dropped. The fall lasted less than 2 seconds. It felt like a lifetime compressed into the sensation of cold air screaming past her face, and the throne room expanding beneath her with terrible speed. She had calculated the trajectory perfectly. She had rehearsed it 400 times in the training vault, beneath the Order's citadel. Her blades were already spinning outward in matching arcs, silver light trailing behind them like twin comets. They never reached him. Kieran's hand moved. That was the only way to describe it, because there was no process, no anticipation, no readable shift in his posture. One moment he was seated on his throne in the attitude of a man who owned every room he had ever entered. The next, he was on his feet, and his right hand had closed around the spinning chain blade mere inches from the center of his chest. The impact sent a concussion of force through the air, a visible wall of displaced pressure that rippled outward and shattered 3 of the nearest shadow lanterns into violet sparks. The wolves in the court stumbled. Goblets fell from tables. The enormous tapestries along the walls billowed inward, as though the room itself had flinched. Lyra landed in a controlled roll and came up fast, already drawing back the second blade for a follow-through strike. She had trained for the possibility that the first attack would fail. She had trained for exactly this. Her body was moving before her mind had finished cataloging the shock of it, the sheer impossible reality of a man catching an enchanted silver chain blade with his bare hand. She swung the second blade in a low sweeping arc aimed at his legs. He caught that one too, not with the same hand. With his other hand, the left one, moving in a blur that her eyes could barely track, the chain snapping taut between his fingers as though it were a length of ordinary rope and he were a man who had never once in his life been impressed by anything. He held both blades, one in each fist, and for a single suspended moment, he simply looked at her. His eyes were the color of midnight given depth and weight, dark enough to absorb light rather than reflect it, and they were absolutely, completely calm. That was the thing that cut through her trained composure like a blade of its own. She had expected rage. She had expected the savage, mindless fury that the Order's teachings promised would live behind every wolf's eyes. What she found instead was something far more dangerous than fury. He was interested. She went for his throat with her elbow, leveraging off the chains still taut between them, using the tension as a fulcrum. He let the chains go at exactly the moment she committed her weight, and she stumbled forward half a step that was all the opening he needed. One hand closed around her wrist, one around her opposite shoulder, and the room turned sideways as he swept her feet out from under her with a motion so economical and precise that it barely looked like effort. The marble floor came up fast. His hand was behind her head before she hit, preventing the impact he clearly did not want her to sustain, which was maddening and infuriating and deeply confusing all at once. She hit the floor controlled and intact. He came down with her, one knee pinning her silver-threaded coat to the marble, his weight and the geometry of his position making every avenue of escape geometrically impossible. He was not sitting on her. He was simply positioned in such a way that movement became theoretical. His face was 12 inches from hers, up close, without the buffer of 60 feet of shadow lantern light between them. The force of his presence was something she felt in her sternum. Lyra stared up at him and did not show him anything on her face. She had been taught to die without flinching. She was prepared to do exactly that. His eyes had begun to change. The deep midnight color had started to glow from within, a cold silver-blue luminescence building behind his irises, the unmistakable visual signature of a supreme alpha channeling lethal intent. She had read descriptions of it in the Order's war chronicles. She had been told that, once those eyes lit fully, the wolf looking through them had crossed past the boundary of mercy into something older and more absolute. The court around them had gone utterly silent. Every wolf in that hall was frozen, watching their supreme alpha in the moment, before he rendered judgment on an assassin who had dropped from his own ceiling. Lyra kept her breathing even. She held his gaze and refused to look away. And then her enchanted silver chains, coiled on the marble between their bodies, began to react. It started as a faint luminescence, the same consecrated silver light she had charged them with in the Order's sanctum, but warmer. Wrong, in the most inexplicable way. Silver light was always cold, always clean and cutting and antiseptic. This light was the color of something organic, something alive, a deep burnished gold that she had never seen come from silver in her life. It pulsed once, the way a heart beats, a single contraction and release of radiance. Kieran looked down at it, the shadow magic she could feel emanating from him, that oppressive textured darkness that the Nightfall Court wielded like a second skin, rippled in response. Not in opposition. In resonance. The two magics moved toward each other the way water moves toward a drain, not by force but by the inexorable logic of something finding where it belongs. The pulse came again, stronger. Lyra felt it before she understood it, a sensation beginning somewhere beneath her ribs and expanding outward through her chest like warmth spreading through cold limbs after long exposure to frost. It was not unpleasant. That was the terrifying part. In a moment of existential threat on the floor of an enemy palace, she was feeling something that she had no name for. A resonance, a recognition, a sense of profound and disorienting rightness that had no business existing anywhere near this man, this wolf, this enemy. Kieran's hands had gone very still. The glowing alpha energy in his eyes had not faded. If anything, it had intensified. But its quality had changed. the way weather changes when the temperature crosses a threshold. Something that had been one thing, becoming something entirely different and new. The third pulse was not a pulse. It was a detonation. The golden light erupted from the space between their bodies and filled the entire throne room in a single instant, wall to wall and floor to ceiling, a blinding, majestic flood of warm radiance that reduced the violet shadow lanterns to memory and made the obsidian throne glow like a coal. It was not violent. It was the opposite of violence. It was the feeling of something ancient and precise clicking into alignment with a resonance that vibrated at a frequency beneath sound, below thought. Something that operated at the level of the soul itself. Every wolf in the room stumbled backward, throwing their arms up against the light. Several fell to their knees. Lyra could not move. Not because he was still pinning her, and not because she had chosen stillness, because the golden light had moved through her like a wave through deep water, and left something in its wake that she did not have language for. A thread, an anchor, a door that had not existed before and could not now be closed. It was warm and vast, and it led, with a certainty more absolute than anything she had ever felt in her disciplined and purposeful life, directly to the man above her. She looked up at Kieran. His face had undergone a transformation she would not have believed if she had not been watching it from 12 inches away. The cold, sovereign authority was still there, the architectural dominance of his features, the sheer overwhelming fact of him. But something new had moved through it, something that had broken the surface of that controlled and ancient power like a continent rising from the sea. His jaw was tight. His eyes, still glowing, were locked on her face with an expression she recognized from the old mythology texts she had studied in the Order's archives. Texts she had always dismissed as romantic embellishment, as the enemy's propaganda dressed up in poetry. She recognized it now as documentation. He looked at her the way the old texts described, as if the world had reorganized itself around a new axis, and she was that axis, as if everything that had existed in his life before this moment had been preamble. The silence in the throne room was absolute. Kieran rose from the floor in a single fluid motion and straightened to his full height, which was a considerable distance above her. He looked at her for 3 more seconds, as though taking inventory of something newly discovered and infinitely precious. Then he bent, and with a gentleness entirely at odds with his size and the preceding 30 seconds of her life, he gathered her from the floor and lifted her over his shoulder as though she weighed nothing. One arm locked across the backs of her knees, her world abruptly inverted. Lyra said nothing. She had no words available. The bond pulsing in her chest was still reverberating, the aftershock of something cosmic and irreversible, and her entire worldview was currently recalibrating itself in real time. Kieran turned to face his court. Every wolf in that vast and shadowed hall was staring at him, staring at her, at the two of them, and the gold light still fading slowly from the marble like sunrise in reverse. His voice, when he spoke, carried the full resonant authority of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be heard. No one touches her. The words settled over the room like a verdict. She is my captive, he said, and then he paused, one beat of silence in which the impossible truth of the last 90 seconds organized itself into something even more impossible. And my queen. He turned and carried her toward the corridor beyond the throne, his stride unhurried, his shoulders straight. The king of the Nightfall Court walking as though the evening had proceeded precisely according to his design. Lyra, suspended over his shoulder with her silver chain blades still lying on his floor, and the golden light of an unbreakable ancient bond humming in her chest, stared at the receding marble of the throne room, and thought only one coherent thought. She had come here to end a war. She had not anticipated becoming the reason one would never need to be fought again. The bedchamber was an insult. That was the first coherent thought Lyra managed after the guards had deposited her inside, and the massive doors had sealed behind them, with the soft, final sound of shadow magic locks engaging. Not fear, not strategy. Pure, incandescent offense at the room itself, because no prison had any right to look like this. The ceiling arched 40 feet overhead, in a vault of dark stone, threaded through with veins of luminescent mineral that pulsed with a slow, breathing light, neither violet nor gold, but somewhere between the two, a deep amber that made the entire chamber feel as though it existed inside a heartbeat. The bed was enormous, canopied in black silk and silver-stitched shadow fabric that shifted like liquid when the ambient light moved across it. There were shelves of books with spines in scripts she half recognized and half did not. There was a fireplace burning with shadow flame, warm despite its darkness. There were tall windows looking out over the Nightfall Court's sprawling obsidian city, 1,000 lights below, cold and beautiful and utterly alien, spreading to the horizon under a sky full of stars she had been taught to navigate and never to admire. There was a bathing room through an archway, and she could see from here that it contained things carved from stone and filled with water that steamed faintly and smelled of something dark and resinous and expensive. It was the most luxurious space she had ever occupied, and she hated every square inch of it. She spent the first hour cataloging exits, because that was what the order had trained her to do. The windows were a 60-foot drop to a courtyard populated with wolves she could hear but not see. The doors were shadow-locked in a way she had no tools to counter, her silver chain blade still somewhere on the throne room floor, and every other weapon stripped from her during the brief, professionally efficient search the guards had conducted before depositing her here. The ventilation shafts were too narrow. The fireplace shared a chimney with something above and below and led nowhere useful. She was contained. She was, in the most comprehensive and mortifying sense of the word, caught. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed because standing felt like conceding something and the floor felt like conceding more, and she thought about the gold light still humming in her chest, quiet now but resident, the way a bell continues to vibrate long after it has been struck. She pressed her palm flat over her sternum and felt it pulse once in response to her attention, warm and terribly patient, as though it had all the time in the world and intended to use it. She took her hand away. She had found the hairpin an hour into her search, which was how thoroughly the order had trained her, in the habit of carrying contingency in places no search would think to look. It was woven into the underside of her collar, slim and silver-tipped, nothing that would read as significant to anyone who did not understand that in the right hands, silver in any form was a conductor of hunter magic. It would not kill a Supreme Alpha. She was under no illusions about that. But it would demonstrate a principle. It would make a point. It was the only point she currently had available to make, and she intended to make it clearly. She heard him before the door opened. Not his footsteps, because he moved with a wolf's silence even in a building his own court had constructed. She heard the change in the air, the subtle atmospheric shift that preceded his presence the way a pressure drop precedes weather. Something dense and electric and unavoidable. The shadow locks disengaged. The doors opened. Kieran of the Nightfall Court stepped into his own bedchamber and looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected to find exactly what he found and was prepared to be entertained by it. He had changed from the formal wear of the throne room into something darker and more spare, a shirt that did nothing to diminish the sheer architectural fact of his shoulders, and he moved through the amber light of the room with an ease that made the space seem sized correctly for the first time. He was, she noted with the same clinical detachment she applied to all tactical assessments, aggressively difficult to look away from. She filed this under known threats and maintained eye contact. He stopped 6 feet away. His gaze moved over the room with brief efficiency, cataloging her cataloging, and then settled back on her face. He said nothing. Lyra rose from the bed, bringing the hairpin up in a clean line aimed at the base of his throat, the silver tip catching the amber light. "I want my weapons," she said. "And I want a door." The silence lasted exactly 1 second. Then the corner of his mouth moved. It was not a full smile. It was the specific expression of a man who has encountered something genuinely unexpected and found it delightful in a way that neither of them would benefit from him saying aloud. He looked at the hairpin with the fond attention of a man examining an interesting artifact, and then he stepped forward. She did not step back. She had decided before he entered the room that she would not step back, and she held that decision through the closing of the 6 feet to 3 feet to 1 foot, until the silver tip of the hairpin was pressing against the center of his chest, and he had simply stopped there, looking down at her with those midnight eyes that had done the impossible thing in the throne room and continued to be deeply inconvenient in the privacy of his own bedchamber. The shadow aura she could feel radiating from him absorbed the silver tip, the way deep water absorbs a thrown stone. It went in and ceased to matter. The pin was not harming him. She had known it would not harm him. The point was the principle. He looked down at the pin and then back at her face, and his expression was the most infuriating combination of amusement and something warmer that she did not wish to name. "You searched for 3 hours, he said. His voice at conversational distance was lower than she had expected, a frequency that seemed to bypass the ear and register somewhere more central. "You found 1 silver hairpin. You waited for me to enter. You held the door in your peripheral vision." He paused. "Your training is extraordinary. It was going to be used to kill you." "I know." He still sounded entertained. "It was not going to succeed." "I'm aware." "And yet you did it anyway." "The point," she said, holding the pin steady, "was the principle." Something moved through his expression then, swift and genuine, and he looked at her for a long moment in a way that felt less like an adversary taking measure and more like something she did not have a clean category for. He reached up, not quickly, not with any quality of threat, and closed 2 fingers around the pin. She released it before he could take it, because letting him take it was different from choosing to lower it, and he seemed to understand the distinction, because he turned the pin over in his fingers once and set it on the table beside him within her reach. "You are not a prisoner in the conventional sense," he said. "I am locked in your room. You are secured in the safest location in the Nightfall Court, while the bond is new, and your presence is not yet known to parties who would use you as leverage against me." He said it without apology, but also without the performance of authority, the way someone states a logistical fact. "When that changes, the door changes." "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to evaluate it over time." He tilted his head slightly. "You are an analyst. You were trained to gather information and revise conclusions. I am telling you this, so you have something to work with." She studied him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was not a concession of some kind. What she did not say was that the golden thread in her chest had been running warmer since he entered the room, a fact she was documenting and quarantining in the part of her mind reserved for information that required further processing before it could be acted upon. The first wave hit her without warning. It came from inside, which was the worst kind of attack, the kind with no direction to face and no ground to defend. One moment she was standing, holding the full tactical composure of a hunter who had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this kind of operation, and the next moment, something inside her chest collapsed inward like a structure whose foundation had been removed, and the room tilted sharply to the left. She recognized it, distantly, even as it hit her. The Order's conditioning spells. 3 years of magical reinforcement designed to keep her bound to the Order's will, to keep her magic aligned with their sanctioned frequencies, to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophic resonance event that had happened in the throne room. The bond had fractured those conditioning spells like a hammer through glass And now the magical architecture that had been woven into her nervous system over years of training was dissolving. And the dissolution felt like every nerve in her body simultaneously receiving an electrical signal it was not designed to process. She was on her knees before she decided to be. The marble floor was very cold and very real, and she pressed her palm against it and focused on that sensation with everything she had. The second wave was worse. It moved through her like a tide going out, pulling something essential with it, and she heard a sound that she did not immediately recognize as coming from herself, low and involuntary, the sound of a person experiencing something beyond the threshold of what composure can contain. She was aware of him moving. Fast, not the way a person crosses a room, but the way a wolf crosses the distance between standing and necessary, eliminating space with a totality that made geometry irrelevant. Then his hands were on her, under her arms, and the floor was no longer the reference point because he was, and she was gathered up against his chest with a surety of grip that made struggling mechanically pointless, and, in some part of her she was not consulting, deeply unnecessary. She did not struggle. The third wave began to crest. Kieran's arms tightened around her. She could feel the shadow magic in him change quality, the dense and territorial energy that had filled the throne room with pressure, shifting into something else. Something that moved toward her instead of outward, warm, and entirely unlike anything she had been told shadow magic felt like. The Order's texts described it as cold, invasive, corrosive to the human spirit. What she was feeling through the places where his hands pressed against her back and her shoulder was none of those things. It was a deep and coherent warmth, organized and purposeful, like sunlight that had been taught to be gentle. It moved into her along the same pathways the conditioning spells had occupied, filling the fractured spaces in her magical architecture with something that asked nothing of her in return for being there. The third wave broke and did not crest. The pain folded inward and went quiet, not suppressed but resolved, the way a question is resolved when the answer finally arrives. She could feel the conditioning spells, or what remained of them, releasing their grip on her nervous system without violence, the foreign magic dissolving under the persistent warmth of what he was channeling into her, the way frost dissolves under morning. The room stopped moving. Her breathing steadied. She was sitting in the arms of the Supreme Alpha of the Nightfall Court, with her cheek against his chest and her fists loosely closed against his shirt. And the amber light of the room was steady, and his heartbeat, under her ear, was slow and even and entirely unhurried. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. His hand moved once, a single pass across her hair. Not performative and not calculated. The gesture of someone responding to an instinct before the conscious decision to respond has been made. She felt him become aware of it a half-second after it happened. The brief tension of a controlled man encountering the edges of his own composure. He did not withdraw. She thought about the Order, about Master Kale's voice in the training vault saying that the suffering of the conditioning was a necessary cost, that the spells were for their own protection, that the pain was a price worth paying for purity of purpose. She thought about 3 years of that pain, low-grade and chronic, and never explained in full, never attributed to its actual cause, presented as a natural consequence of hunter magic rather than the deliberate architectural work of people who needed her bound to their will rather than her own. She thought about Kieran, who had every legitimate reason to end her life on the floor of his throne room and had instead carried her here, who had set the hairpin within her reach, who was currently channeling his own life force into her body to resolve a pain she had not told him about, because he had simply seen it and responded. The monster, the Order had called him, the beast, the thing that wore a man's face to conceal a wolf's nature. She was beginning to suspect that the Order had never actually met him. She did not say this aloud. She was not ready to say it aloud, and she was not certain she would trust herself if she were. But she held the thought carefully, in the part of her mind where she kept things that had already been decided by evidence, even if the conclusions had not yet been formally drawn, and she did not dismiss it. The golden bond in her chest pulsed once, warm and certain. For the first time in 3 years, nothing in her hurt. She had been in the Nightfall Court for 6 days when the order came for her, not to retrieve her. She understood the distinction the moment she saw the formation, because she knew those configurations. She had trained inside them, she had stood at their perimeters in a dozen operations, and understood their tactical grammar as fluently as spoken language. What she saw moving through the outer corridors of the palace was not a rescue formation. It was a containment and elimination grid, 2 flanking units to prevent escape. A curse anchor team at the center, carrying the kind of ritual equipment you deployed when your objective was not recovery but neutralization. She recognized the pale blue sigil light of a dark light curse being assembled in the hands of 3 high casters, positioned at perfect triangular spacing. She recognized the targeting matrix they were building. It was pointed at her. Lyra stood at the tall window of the corridor where she had been walking, the first supervised movement through the palace that Kieran had permitted in 6 days. And she felt the architecture of everything she believed rearrange itself around a single unavoidable fact. The order had not come to bring her home. The order had come to ensure that she did not come home, that the compromised asset was disposed of cleanly before whatever she had learned inside these walls could be carried back and used to ask questions they did not wish to answer. 3 years. 3 years of training, of conditioning, of pain she had been told was necessary and righteous, and the price of purpose. 3 years of being shaped into exactly the kind of instrument you send on a suicide mission and do not expect to return, and when the suicide mission produced an outcome outside the sanctioned parameters, when the instrument had the wrong reaction to the wrong magic in the wrong throne room, the instrument was reclassified from asset to liability, and the appropriate protocol was initiated. She thought of Master Kale's voice, patient, measured, admiring. "You are our finest work, Lyra. You are the tip of the Order's spear." She had been a spear. Now she was a loose end. The dark light curse released from the triangular formation with the particular sound of consecrated silver magic being weaponized, a high, pure tone that she had heard in training drills and always associated with the clean authority of the Order's power. She had loved that sound. She had trained toward it, oriented by it, found her purpose in it the way a compass finds north. Hearing it deployed against her own body recontextualized every memory she had built around it. It hit her like the sky had been brought indoors. The paralyzing field of a dark light curse did not hurt in the conventional sense. What it did was reach into the space between intention and action and remove the connection entirely, so that her mind was completely present and her body had become theoretical, a fact she was aware of but could not access. She felt herself begin to fall before she could stop herself from falling, the slow, terrible geometry of a body that has lost its own cooperation, and the marble floor rose toward her with the same patient indifference it had offered in the throne room 6 days ago. She did not reach it this time either. But the hands that caught her were not gentle in the way they had been gentle in the bedchamber. They were the hands of something that had arrived past the boundary of its composure. She could not turn her head. The curse had her completely, every voluntary system suspended in the pale blue field of the Order's magic. But she could see, and what she saw in her peripheral vision was Kieran. And the Kieran who had come through that corridor wall, because he had come through the wall rather than wait for the doorway, was not the man who had set a hairpin within her reach, or channeled warmth into her fractured nervous system, or held her through the dissolution of 3 years of someone else's architecture. He was not a man at all in this moment. He was the Supreme Alpha, and he was in a state that had no diplomatic description. The shadow magic around him had escaped the controlled, textured quality she had come to recognize as his baseline. The deliberate density of a power held precisely because its holder understood exactly what it could do if it were not. It had stopped being textured and become something elemental. Something that rose from him the way a storm rises from warm water, enormous and self-organizing, and no longer particularly interested in the preferences of anyone in its vicinity. The corridor darkened around him as though the ambient light itself had decided this was not its moment. Shadow moved along the ceiling and walls in the way water moves along a surface that has learned the shape of flow. He looked at the Order's formation, and the Order's formation took a collective step backward. Lyra would have smiled if the curse had left her the capability. In 6 days, she had catalogued his power with the professional attention of a hunter who needed to understand what she was housed with. She had observed his controlled deployments, his incidental expressions of authority, the way his presence reorganized every space he entered. None of that cataloging had prepared her for this. None of it had accounted for the variable she was watching now, which was a supreme alpha whose mate had just been struck down in his own halls by people who had sent her there to die. He raised one hand. The shadow magic went outward from him in a wave. Not a directed strike, not the precise targeting of a weapon being aimed, but a concussion of pure, overwhelming force that operated the way a tide operates, not caring about the specific placement of the obstacles it encounters, simply moving and rearranging everything that was not the ground. The 3 high casters of the Order were lifted off the floor simultaneously and deposited against the far wall with enough force to end the curse assembly entirely, and not enough force to end anything else. The flanking units found themselves moving backward at speed they had not chosen, the shadow wave passing through the corridor in both directions and simply relocating everyone in it to the positions it preferred. The dark light curse matrix, deprived of its anchor casters, fractured. It did not disappear. The residual magic of a broken dark light curse had its own momentum, its own half-life, and it was still moving through her when Kieran crossed the corridor in the 3 strides it took him to reach her, and the warmth of his hands on her arms and the familiar density of his aura pressing against the curse field was not enough entirely yet. But it was enough to make the field's grip less absolute, enough to tell the magic that there was something in the environment that outweighed its instructions. He lowered himself around her, and she understood after a disoriented moment that he was shielding her with his body, using the mass and the magical density of himself as a physical barrier between her and the dissipating curse residue moving through the corridor. Every broad angle of his frame positioned to intercept what was still in the air before it could reach her. He said her name. Just her name, low and direct, with nothing else in his voice except the word itself and the fact that he was saying it, which contained more than she had space to process. She tried to speak, and found she had approximately a third of her voice available. The curse field was losing cohesion in the presence of his shadow magic, the pale blue dissolving slowly at its edges into something that could not sustain itself against a superior force, but slowly was still in progress, and she was still largely theoretical. What she did have, she discovered, was her right hand. The curse had not fully reached it, or his proximity had already released it. She was not certain which, but she found that if she focused her entire conscious attention on that one point of contact between her intention and her body, she could move it. Incrementally and with effort, the way you move through deep water, but available. She raised it. Her palm found his jaw. The shadow stubble of it was rough under her fingers, and she felt him go absolutely still beneath her touch the way he had gone still in the throne room when the gold light first pulsed, the total suspension of a man encountering something that stops everything else. She had been fighting the bond for 6 days. She had documented it, quarantined it, held it at the clinical distance of a professional cataloging a variable she did not wish to incorporate. She had told herself that acknowledgement was not acceptance, that feeling it was not the same as choosing it, that the warmth it offered was a temptation to be assessed rather than a truth to be lived. She looked at his face, at the controlled fury still visible in the line of his jaw, at the eyes still burning with the storm light of a power that had deployed itself completely on her behalf without negotiation, at the evidence of the last 6 days that she had been assembling in the part of her mind that processed facts rather than doctrine. He had given her access to his shelves. He had explained his decisions rather than issuing them. He had healed her without being asked, and returned her weapon within her reach, and called her extraordinary when she aimed a hairpin at his throat and held space in the amber light of his bedchamber for her silence, when she needed silence more than words. He had put his body between her and residual magic in a corridor where the enemies were her own people, and he had said her name in a voice that had nothing in it except her. The Order had sent her here to die, and then come back to make certain she had. She tightened her fingers against his jaw. The bond, which had been resident and patient and quiet for 6 days, recognized the change in the quality of her attention, the way the sea recognizes a shift in wind direction, not because it needed to be told, but because it had always known the difference between proximity and presence, between observation and arrival. She stopped fighting it. The gold light did not erupt this time. It did not need to erupt, because this was not a collision, but a completion, the difference between a door being forced and a door being opened from the inside. It moved through her in a single deep wave, warm and massive and entirely unhurried, filling every fractured space in her magical architecture with something that carried no conditions and no cost beyond the simple fact of being chosen. She felt it reach the pale blue residue of the curse field and simply resolve it, not violently, not with the quality of opposition, but with the overwhelming mathematics of a greater thing displacing a lesser one, the way light displaces shadow by existing, by having no alternative. The paralysis dissolved. Her body was hers again, and the first thing she did with it was breathe. A full and unrestricted breath that tasted like the amber light of the room she had come to recognize as the only space in 6 days where nothing had hurt. And she felt that familiar resonance in her chest, warm and certain, the same pulse that had been waiting for her to catch up to what it already knew. Kieran's forehead came down to rest against hers. His eyes were closed, the stormlight receding, the shadow magic settling back into the controlled and textured density of his baseline. The fury was still in the set of his jaw, but it had been reclassified. She could feel it even before he spoke. No longer directed outward but inward, the particular rage of someone who has been prevented from being somewhere important, and arrived to find the cost already paid. His hand came up and covered hers where it was still pressed against his face. "They will not reach you again," he said. Quiet. Absolute. Not a promise constructed for her benefit, but a fact being stated by someone who understood the full weight of what he was saying and meant every syllable of it. She thought about the Order, about what they had built her into and what they had intended her to remain. She thought about the dark light curse aimed at her own coordinates and the formation grammar she had recognized from the inside, and she thought about the 6 days of evidence she had been compiling, and she made the formal decision that had been implicit in her thinking since the bedchamber, since the amber light and the hair and the returned hairpin. She was not going back. Not because the doors were locked. The doors, she suspected, would not be locked much longer, because he had promised her they would not be. And she had spent 6 days discovering that he kept his promises with the same absolute consistency he applied to everything else he committed to. She was not going back because there was nothing left to go back to. The Order she had believed in had never existed. The people she had trained under had constructed her as a weapon and treated the weapon's survival as a negotiable concern. The doctrine she had lived by was a closed system designed to prevent exactly the kind of questioning she was now engaged in, and she had reached the limit of what doctrine could contain. The bond pulsed again, and this time she did not document it. She felt it, warm and mutual, running between them in both directions with the easy permanence of something that had always been true and was only now being acknowledged. She had come to the Nightfall Court to end a war. She was beginning to understand that the war worth ending was not the one she had been sent to fight. The uniform had been waiting for her. She had not asked for it, and no one had announced it. She had simply found it folded on the table in the amber-lit bedchamber the morning after the Order's attack, and she had stood over it for a long moment, understanding that it was not a gesture of control, but of recognition. The fabric was dark as deep water, woven through with threads of nightfall shadow magic that shifted when the light moved across it, the way the silk of the canopy shifted, alive in a way that hunter gear had never been. At the collar and cuffs, silver threading had been worked in patterns she recognized as her own, the angular precision of the Silver Moon Order's technical language, rendered in the Nightfall Court's materials, her history and her present spoken in the same sentence. Her silver chain blades lay beside it, retrieved from the throne room floor and cleaned and returned without comment. She dressed and felt, for the first time in her adult life, like something she had chosen to be, rather than something she had been made. Kieran was waiting in the corridor outside, and when he looked at her, the expression on his face was not the arrogant assessment of a man surveying a possession, but something quieter and more fundamental. The look of a person who has found a thing they did not know they were missing, and is only now understanding the full dimensions of what its absence had cost. He said nothing. He offered her his arm, not in the courtly performative sense, but in the practical one, with a straightforwardness that she had come to understand was his baseline mode of operation when the audience was only her. She took it. They walked out of the Nightfall Palace together into the early morning, and the court that watched them pass was very still. The sanctuary of the Silver Moon Order occupied the high ground of the capital city, as it always had, as the Order had always insisted upon, both architecturally and metaphorically. It was built from pale stone that caught light and held it, gleaming and self-righteous on its hill, the great windows depicting scenes from the Order's founding mythology in colored glass that had always read to Lyra as history and now read as something considerably more curated. The great doors were sealed with consecrated silver light, and the perimeter was held by 12 sanctuary guards in the Order's formal white. The guards saw them coming from a considerable distance. This was, Lyra reflected, exactly the intention. She had spent 6 days learning that Kieran operated on the principle that overwhelming presence communicated more efficiently than any opening move, that the negotiation had already begun before the first word was spoken, and the terms being communicated now by 2 figures walking toward the sanctuary in the early morning light were simple and non-negotiable. The guards held their positions until they did not. It was not a decision made from cowardice. She could see the moment they registered the bond light, the faint ambient gold that had begun to emanate from both of them since the corridor, the magical signature of a completed mating bond between a Supreme Alpha and his mate, and the tactical calculation that followed. 12 guards against those odds was not a defensive formation. It was a gesture. They stepped aside. The great doors opened without being touched, Kieran's shadow magic moving ahead of them like a courteous announcement, and they walked into the sanctuary together. Archbishop Seven was already standing at the altar at the far end of the nave, which meant his intelligence network had told him they were coming, which meant he had had time to prepare, and had chosen to wait here rather than run. Lyra read this correctly as the decision of a man who had confused the sanctuary's symbolic power with actual power, who believed the weight of 6 centuries of institutional authority would function as a weapon in this room. His staff was raised, the consecrated silver at its head blazing with gathered light magic, his casters arrayed in a semicircle behind him in the formation she recognized from the corridor. The same formation that had aimed a dark light curse at her coordinates. Looking at him now, she felt none of the deference that 3 years of conditioning had built into her responses to his rank. What she felt was a clarity so complete it was almost restful. The particular quality of vision available to someone who has finally seen a thing for exactly what it is, and found it considerably smaller than the shadow it had been casting. Kieran's hand, which had been at the small of her back, moved away. She understood this without being told. They had not discussed tactics in explicit terms, but 6 days of proximity to a man who communicated more in silence than most people communicated in full sentences had given her a fluency in his operational instincts. He moved left along the outer aisle, shadow magic unspooling from him in dark threads that moved along the stone floor toward the Archbishop's formation, with the patient, directional purpose of water finding its level. She moved right, along the opposite aisle, her silver chain blades already in her hands, the familiar weight of them recontextualized by everything she now understood about what they were and what they were for. They were instruments of precision. Today, they would be precise. The Archbishop raised his staff, and the first wave of condensed light magic came down the center of the nave, in a column wide enough to fill the aisle, blazing and absolute, aimed at where they had been standing when he released it. They were not there. The column struck the stone floor at the nave's center and spread outward in a burst of white light that illuminated the sanctuary completely for 2 full seconds before it dissipated. Kieran's shadow threads reached the caster formation. They moved upward from the floor and wrapped around the caster's arms and legs with a surgical economy of motion. Not violently, not with the tidal force she had seen him deploy in the corridor, but with a precision that was somehow more impressive because of its restraint. Each caster was held in place, their magic suspended, their expressions registering the specific shock of people who have spent their careers wielding power and have just encountered a ceiling. They remained unharmed, upright, and completely unable to act. Kieran walked through them the way a man walks through a space that has been cleared for him. The Archbishop turned his staff toward Kieran. Lyra was already moving. She had calculated the geometry of it while they were walking the outrails, and the calculation had been correct. The Archbishop's concentration, directed toward the larger magical threat, had created an angular exposure that his training had not accounted for, because his training had never included the possibility of fighting someone who had been built by his own institution and understood its methodology as intimately as she did. She came from his right, and her silver chain blades were not aimed at him but at the staff, the source, the architecture of the power he had spent decades accumulating and learning to weaponize. The enchanted silver of the chains connected with the staff's consecrated head, and the sound it made was not violent. It was musical, a pure high tone that rang through the sanctuary and rose toward the colored glass ceiling, and hung there, resonant, for a long moment after the physical event had concluded. The staff fractured from its head to its base in a clean and total line. The light magic it had been holding went out, not explosively, but immediately, like a candle when the wick is removed, present in one instant and simply gone in the next. The gathered power of 6 decades of the Archbishop's accumulation and the institutional authority of the Silver Moon Order's highest office dissolved into the air of the sanctuary, with no more ceremony than morning mist when the sun arrives. Seven's knees found the stone floor, not from any force applied to him, but from the simple mechanics of a man who has lost the thing he built his standing on and discovered, in its absence, that standing was all he had. He looked up at her, and in his face she found no monster. She found a man who had made choices and built systems to justify those choices, and then built institutions to protect the systems, and trained generations of people to defend the institutions, and who was now in the position of every architect of a closed system when the walls finally come down. He looked, more than anything else, like someone who had always known this moment was possible, and had spent decades ensuring he would not have to think about it. Lyra looked back at him without satisfaction and without cruelty. She said, simply, what was true. It's over. The colored glass in the sanctuary windows had begun to release their held light as the Archbishop's foundational magic dissolved, the scenes of Order mythology fading slowly from the panes and letting in the actual morning, which was turning out to be considerably more beautiful than the stories that had been filtering it. It came through the cleared glass in warm, unmediated gold, moving across the stone floor of the nave in long, honest lines. She felt Kieran before she heard him, the familiar density of his presence arriving at her back, the shadow magic settling into its composed and controlled baseline, the ambient warmth of the bond running between them in both directions with the easy permanence it had acquired since the corridor. His hand found her waist, and she turned within the circle of his arm, and the sanctuary around them was full of morning light and the last slow drift of magical embers where the Archbishop's power had been. He looked at her the way he had looked at her when she came out of the bedchamber in the dark tactical uniform, and the way he had looked at her in every unguarded moment of 6 days that she had filed carefully and now no longer needed to quarantine from her conclusions. He pulled her closer, and she went without resistance, because resistance had been the posture of someone who had not yet decided, and she had decided in a corridor with her hand on his jaw, and the bond finally allowed to be what it had always been. The kiss was not gentle. It was not the tentative, provisional contact of two people navigating unfamiliar territory. It was the kiss of two people who had been moving toward each other at high velocity through opposing forces for long enough that the arrival contained everything the journey had cost, certain and fierce and warm, tasting of shadow magic and morning light, and 6 days of evidence accumulating toward a conclusion that had been inevitable since a hunter dropped from a glass ceiling and changed the shape of the world. When he lifted his head, his eyes were dark and warm, and absolutely without the performance of authority. He spoke at the volume of a man who has no one to address except the person in front of him. Every court in this realm will know your name, he said. Not as my captive, not as my consort. His hand tightened at her waist. As my queen. Untouchable. Equal. Mine, as I am yours. The bond answered him before she did, a pulse of gold warmth that moved through both of them simultaneously, the magical ratification of a truth that needed no further argument. She looked at him, at the morning light on his face, and the shadow magic settled contentedly around his shoulders like something that had finally come home, at the man behind the supreme alpha who had caught her blade and set her hairpin within reach and held her through the dissolution of someone else's architecture and put his body between her and everything that wished her harm. She had been trained to hunt a monster. She said, "Mine, as you are mine," and felt the words settle into the permanent record of the bond with the weight of a vow, which was what they were. They walked out of the sanctuary together into the full morning, past the Archbishop's knelt figure and the shadow-bound casters who would be released when there was a structure of actual justice to receive them, past the sanctuary guards who had stepped aside and now stood uncertain at the perimeter, past the colored glass that had finally let the light through. The city spread below them, both halves of it, the pale stone of the Order's capital and the dark obsidian of the Nightfall Court sprawl, and from the high ground of the sanctuary hill they could see where the two territories met, that long border that had been a wound in the landscape for 6 centuries and was, as of this morning, a line waiting to be erased. There was work ahead. There was reconstruction and reckoning, and the long, difficult labor of replacing a system built on fear and doctrine with something built on the kind of evidence she had been gathering for 6 days in a bedchamber full of amber light. She knew this. She was not naive about the distance between an ending and a beginning. But she had been trained to assess evidence and revise conclusions, and the evidence of this morning was clear. In the epilogue of her life as a hunter, Lyra of the Silver Moon Order had carried a single unexamined conviction into the Nightfall Palace, which was that the enemy had a face, and that face was monstrous, and that her purpose was to find it and extinguish it. She had dropped through a glass ceiling with that conviction as her entire architecture, and she had been wrong in a way that no training and no doctrine and no 6 centuries of institutional history had been adequate to prepare her for. She had been raised to destroy a monster, and found instead a man who caught her blade and called her extraordinary, and held her through her pain, and set her weapons within reach, and stepped into a hairpin without flinching, and who had given her the one thing 3 years of the Order's construction had never included in its design for her. Not safety, not purpose, not the clean satisfaction of doctrine fulfilled. She had been given the truth about herself, which was that she was not an instrument, or an asset, or a weapon shaped for someone else's war. She was a person capable of revising her conclusions when the evidence warranted, and the evidence had warranted, and she had revised them, and everything that followed from that revision had been the most honest, and most terrifying, and most irreversibly correct thing she had ever done. She had been trained her whole life to hunt a monster. She had found instead that the truest love she had ever known, the deepest safety and the most absolute belonging, had been waiting for her in the arms of the enemy, in the amber-lit bedchamber of the Supreme Alpha of the Nightfall Court, where a hairpin had been set within her reach, and a hand had moved through her hair before its owner had decided to move it. She had come to end a war. She had found, instead, the reason peace was worth building. If you enjoyed this epic fantasy romance audiobook, please hit the like button and subscribe for more amazing stories.